Hitchcock once said, "There is a distinct difference between suspense and surprise, and yet many pictures continually confuse the two." He then goes on to describe the same scenario using both suspense and surprise. In the first, surprise, you have a group of people sitting at a table, just talking. Suddenly, a bomb goes off. Your audience gets that brief emotional jolt of surprise. Compare this to the suspense scene, where we see the people sitting around the table talking, but we also see the clock ticking on the bomb underneath the table. It has a 5-minute timer. The whole time those people are sitting there talking, your audience is in suspense, waiting for a release of the tension, whether that release comes when the bomb goes off or the people find it or some other way. The closer the bomb goes to going off, the more suspense or tension your audience is going to feel, despite the fact that all the people are doing is sitting around talking. This is a rather famous example, and a lot of people refer to the bomb under the table. Our writing group actually talks about that all the time. This is one of the things that I wanted to talk about today as I talk about the things that I personally think are the most important things to get right in your book as you're writing a novel. I would love to hear from you in the comments below what you think are the most important things to get right in a book. So one of the first things that I think is so important that some people discount because they think that it can make your story formulaic, but I disagree. I think that story structure is one of the most important things to get right in a book. I think without story structure, you're going to have a really hard time coming up with a compelling story that keeps your reader's interest. The way that you set up your story structure highly affects things like pacing and character arc. Character arc is probably one of the most important things for me when I'm reading a book. If the execution of the character arc is not well done, then for me the story usually falls flat, especially at the end. Where if they can pull off the ending of a character arc, then even if the beginning is slow or the pacing is off or something, then it generally ends up being a fairly good read for me. Things like the story dragging, the story getting slow, losing interest in the middle, or the ending feeling rushed, those are all story structure issues most of the time. The second thing that I think is so important is tension. And this goes back to the bomb under the table. And I think there are two main types of tension that we need to pay attention to. There is the tension overarching across the entire book. What are the stakes raised throughout the book? Then there's like the individual tension within the scene. And if you want a really good example of this done well, then I would highly recommend watching Lost in Space. Lost in Space, the reboot on Netflix. They're just so good at tension. And they have this, in every single episode, there's like an overarching problem that creates a lot of tension. But then every single scene has its own tension within the family, with things going wrong, with the bad guys. But then the overarching tension is always there. And then they resolve it really nicely at the end each episode, where you can kind of wrap up the tension, where the tension, either the bomb goes off or they defuse the bomb or whatever. And so the tension there is done really well. Another really good example of this is actually Harry Potter. Even though not every single scene in Harry Potter is like a super tense scene, she does a really good job of drawing out the tension. Like even if you just look at the example of when Harry is going towards platform 9 3/4 and he's running to go through it, she draws out that scene. You can go look at that scene and it's like really drawn out, where it's not just like, oh, he's gonna go through it, oh, he went through it. It's like this like mini tense scene, and it's not actually like oh no, like a thriller or something, but she just draws that tension as tight as she can before finally releasing it. J.K. Rowling is really good at drawing the tension out in each scene, whatever type of tension there is. The next thing that I think is so important is foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is more than just, oh no, this big event's gonna happen, I better foreshadow it. Foreshadowing has a lot to it. And it really helps with keeping the reader interested. So like if you foreshadow something well enough, then they're going to want to stick around to have kind of that, it almost creates a tension that they want a release from. They want to see that the actual execution of what you're foreshadowing. And so they'll stick around to figure that out. But it also actually helps with helping your book feel real and like the immersion of it, so that you're not like, oh, they're making this up on the spot. For example, I once read a book that had genies in it, and then about halfway through the book, all of a sudden there were mermaids. And I was like, wait, there are other magical creatures in this world, and I didn't know that. Where if they had mentioned mermaids or other magical creatures 2 or 3 times throughout the books, even just briefly, throughout the book, then that wouldn't have surprised me, and it would have felt like a natural part of the world rather than breaking the immersion for me and having me go, wait, what? And it just really helps your reader to not feel like you're just making it up as you go. Even if you are, even if you're a pantser, you can go back and add foreshadowing in later. And it can be really simple, like having a book about mermaids, or mentioning, you know, as long as you do it a couple times to reinforce, because readers can skip over things or forget things. As long as you do it a couple times, it can be really small when it comes to that. Anything important or big that happens later in the book should be mentioned at least 2 or 3 times earlier in the book. And there's also like the foreshadowing of atmosphere. Hunger Games does this really well. Before they ever get to the stadium, the foreshadowing, just atmospheric blood and stuff. Like I think at one point there's a bloody nose or something, and it really helps you to get the right feel for what the book is going to be, and that's a type of foreshadowing as well. The next thing that I think is really important, and I think most people would agree because it's talked about a lot, is showing rather than telling. I think that one way that you can do this is just by making things really concrete. The more concrete and less abstract you are, the more that you are showing, I think. So instead of saying, you know, and that kind of goes back to the instead of giving them 4, give them 2 + 2. I really like that analogy, but for me, using concrete words, so like instead of saying she was sad, you show the tears, right? The tears are concrete. It's something that people can feel with their senses. Anything that you can feel with your senses, I think, is a really good way of showing. Another thing that I think is really important in a book is the balance of information. You want to make sure, and this ties in with show, don't tell, but you want to make sure that you are not info dumping. But this can get really tricky because you want to give them enough information that they are wanting to stick around. So one rule of thumb that I've heard is that you want to give enough information that it creates questions for the reader, but you don't want to give enough information that those questions are answered until the end of the book, or until you're purposefully answering them. Sometimes you do want them to know what it is earlier on, like the midpoint is a really good time to reveal information, and there are certain points of the book where it might just work with the flow, but you want to make sure that you're giving enough information to create questions around that reveal, but then don't give them enough to reveal it until the end. And I've read too many books where I've read the first chapter and I'm like, oh, I'm really intrigued about this, and then the next chapter they basically info dump and tell me the whole backstory, and I'm like, well, now I'm not interested in your book at all. So yeah, I think it's really important to find that balance of information. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is empathy. You want to make sure that your reader is feeling the same thing as your character. I just started reading a book about creating emotions in your readers, and so I'm hoping to learn more about this in that book. But he talks about how, you know, sometimes writers make the mistake of thinking that because their character is crying, that the reader is also going to be crying, and that is not necessarily true. So making your reader care about your character, which I have a video on that, so I can share that as well, about how to help your reader care about your character, even if they don't like your character. Making them care can help to make your reader feel what your character is feeling. But I do think that that is one of the most important things in a book, and it might actually be number one, because if your reader doesn't care about your character, or if they're not feeling what your character is feeling, then why are they reading the book? So those are kind of the main things that, as of right now, I think are the most important things to make your book good. And they're definitely things that I am still working on and learning about. So if you have any writing craft books or videos talking about these topics, I would love for you to share them with me in the comments below so I can go learn more about them. And again, I would love to hear what you think is some of the most important things that make up a good book. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up and subscribe for lots of reading and writing content. And if you want to follow my reading journey, you can check out my Goodreads. I do post a review for every book that I read there. And you can also check out my Instagram, where I share my favorite books as well as my writing journey. Thank you so much for watching my video. I will see you in the next one.